Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the TED in Your Head podcast. As a hypnotherapist in private practice for over 20 years, I've created this podcast to share some of the things that I feel might be helpful to your health, happiness, and success. What I do as a hypnotherapist is I help people change thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that don't serve them, such as anxiety and depression, and behaviors such as procrastination or smoking, for example. The idea is that a lot of what goes on in your mind that doesn't serve you is because of your subconscious programming. In other words, the things your mind learned that don't serve you or benefit you any longer. That's what I help people change. Now, we've been programmed in a lot of ways that might not necessarily serve us. Some of this programming came from other people, but some also came from us, from beliefs we formed a long time ago, from decisions we made during times of stress or trauma, and from things we saw or heard that we believed were true. Now, most of this happens before you're around 8 or 9 years old, but it can happen after that as well. So the question is, how can we be aware of this programming and how can we start to change it? So that leads us to the topic of today's podcast. I recently ordered some copies of my book from Amazon. Here's a copy of my book. It's called The Ultimate Guide to Letting Go of Negativity and Fear and Loving Life. You can get it on Amazon. And anyway, I was kind of leafing through it and I came across this chapter called What About the Voice in Your Head? And I thought, this is such an important topic. I really should revisit it. Now, this particular chapter in my book started as a blog post back in 2007. Then I turned it into a podcast for podcast number 4. Today's podcast is number 460. So this topic was, I thought, important enough for the number 4 podcast that I ever made. So I'm going to kind of reboot it and add some new stuff to it. But the topic of today's podcast is, what about that voice in your head? Now, you have a voice in your head. You probably know this. If you don't, you should. You might be thinking, what voice? What is he talking about? I don't have a voice. Maybe he has a voice in his head, but I certainly do not have one in mine. Well, that's what I'm talking about, that voice. And it's okay. We all have a voice in our head, maybe more than one. The voice in your head goes by many names: thinking, monkey mind, internal chatter, running commentary, self talk. This voice allows us to make sense of our world. We judge, we analyze, we compare, we search for meaning, patterns, relationships. What most people call this voice is me, I, myself. The important thing to remember here is that the voice in your head is not you. It's a tool that you use, just like a hammer is a tool, but the hammer is not you. But here's the problem. We think the voice is who we are. Consequently, we believe everything the voice says. Like that t-shirt. Have you ever seen that t-shirt that says, I just do what the voices tell me to do? I love that t-shirt. I want to get one. Did you ever experience saying something out loud and then thinking to yourself, that is totally something my mother or my father would say? Was that your voice? Or was it your mother or father's voice? Or grandmother, grandfather, teacher, coach, etc.? How much of the voice in your head is really your own? How much of the voice in your head is the voice of someone else? Good question. In my hypnotherapy practice, I call this voice self-talk. One of the first questions I ask my hypnotherapy clients is, what does your self-talk sound like? What do you say to yourself? What does the voice in your head say to you most of the time? And most importantly, is your self-talk serving you? Think about it. Is the voice in your head supportive, encouraging, or is it discouraging? Have you ever heard the voice in your head say, I'm no good at fill in the blank, or I'm a failure, or I'll never be able to do this thing I want to do, or I'm such an idiot, or I hate looking at myself in the mirror? Now, to some extent, we've all said these things, but does this type of self-talk dominate your life? If so, then that could be a problem. One of the most difficult things for us as modern humans is to get some distance from the voice so that we can observe it. And that's how we can begin to change it. That's why practices like meditation can be so valuable. When we meditate, we set time aside so that we can step back and observe the voice in our heads. Why is that a good thing? Well, because most of us are slaves to the voice in our heads. Until we can observe the voice with some kind of detachment, it will rule us. If you want more freedom from unwanted thoughts, more peace of mind, try this. Throughout the day, ask yourself the following questions. What's happening in my mind right now? What am I thinking now? And how does this thinking make me feel? How does thinking these thoughts make me feel? It's called self-inquiry, and it's a powerful practice. Realize, if you will, that you create your reality using the voice in your head with your thinking, thought by thought, sentence by sentence. We end up believing the reality we create with our thoughts, and we act from those beliefs. Now, this idea of our thoughts not being who we are is a very ancient idea. This line of inquiry can be quite complex, ranging from the deeply philosophical to the obvious and mundane. On the one hand, there's the concept of the ego and the question of who am I, which is one of the big questions of human existence. On the other hand, for most of us, there's the awareness that there are habitual patterns of thinking in our heads that are, at the very least, self-limiting, if not self-defeating. You may have heard of the 17th century philosopher by the name of Descartes, who is famous for the statement, I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum, which he saw as a primary truth. 300 years later, another famous philosopher, Jean-Paul Sartre, realized that when you are aware that you are thinking, that awareness is not part of thinking. These concepts are discussed in depth in two books that I highly recommend called The Power of Now and A New Earth, both by Eckhart Tolle. Great books. For our purposes, let us assume for a second that who you are is not your thoughts. Consider that who you really are is the thinker of your thoughts. That is, who you are is the awareness that you are thinking or that you have a thought. Stay with me for a second here, okay? See, the problem that plagues most of us modern humans is that we really believe that who we are is our thoughts. Thoughts such as, I'm no good at this, or I'm good at that, or this is who I am, or this is who I am not. Who we think we are and what we say we are, we can call our story. Each of us has a story about who we are. Consider that for the most part, this story is not real, it's invented. Consider that we created or maybe inherited this story or stories. Consider the two statements. My business failed and I am a failure. The first statement, my business failed, is a statement of fact. That is, it's a statement of what happened, if somebody were to say that. The second, I am a failure, is a story about what happened, an interpretation, right? We can agree that not everyone who has had a business fail is a failure. So one of the most important skills that we can learn to develop is to be able to make the distinction between who we are and what we think, and to understand that most, if not all of our thoughts are interpretations or stories of events, and may have little to do with what really happened or what's really going on out there. The reason you want to learn that skill is so that you can have some detachment from your thoughts, so that you can observe them and change them if they're not working for you. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, the voice in your head might be saying, geez, Ted, enough already with this psychobabble. I get it. But here's the thing you need to get. If you want to get what you want, whatever that is, you need to identify the story the voice in your head is telling you about why you can't have it. If you can't identify those limiting thoughts and beliefs, then like Yoda said, forever they will dominate your destiny. We believe the voice in our head, and most of the time we do what it tells us to do. The Buddha said we become what we think about. And once you have an awareness of those patterns of thinking that are self limiting, self defeating, or self destructive, then you can start to change them. It's not easy because our tendency is to identify with our thinking. We can become so attached to what we think and believe that we will even defend our beliefs to the point of killing someone who disagrees with us. And that is, unfortunately, the history of human behavior. Some people say it's our nature to be violent. That may be the case. I'm not so sure I agree with that. But because of our capacity to be aware of our thinking and change it, we can change our nature. Let me tell you an interesting story. I was working with a young man, a young single man. He had many friends who liked to hike because they lived in a rural area and there was great hiking in the area, and they often invited this young man to join them. He always politely declined, saying that he has no interest in hiking and he doesn't hike. And although he wouldn't admit it to his friends, he considers hiking a waste of time and not very safe because there's wild animals and insects, dangerous terrain, and sometimes dangerous humans. He won't really admit to being afraid, but he doesn't see hiking as a practical and worthwhile recreational activity. He says that he feels comfortable staying home reading a good book. One day, the young man met a young woman he was attracted to, and he came to my office shortly after that. What happened was they went out on a date, and she told him that she really liked to hike. Now, the young man didn't reveal his feelings about hiking because he wanted to continue seeing her, and he felt, quite correctly, that his chances were better if he kept his mouth shut. But she immediately suggested that they go hiking together, and before he could object, a date is set. So, in spite of his indifference to hiking, he goes along to get along. They go on their hike, and after a while, they come to a pleasant spot in the forest. She pulls a blanket out of her backpack along with a nice bottle of wine and some crackers and cheese. He's kind of impatient to start back and finish the hike when a book she's reading falls out of her backpack. And the young man sees that it's a book he has read and feels quite passionate about. So spend the next hour picnicking and discussing the book. At the end of the day, the young man reflected back on his experience, and he decided that for the most part he enjoyed himself, and he would do it again, even though he would rather go to a park than for a hike. And it was at this point that he started to wonder to himself, why do I dislike hiking? I've never really hiked. What is it about it that I don't like? Now he has detachment from the thought, I don't like to hike. And he begins to see this statement not as truth, but as a story he's been telling himself for some time, since he has no real experience with hiking. And then, in our conversations, he remembered a time when he asked his dad if he could join the Boy Scouts. And his dad said, I know that the Boy Scouts do a lot of hiking, but I don't think it's safe to be hiking around out there where someone could get hurt or bit by a snake or an animal. Besides, it's a waste of time when you could be doing your homework or reading a book. The young man realized that his story about not liking hiking was given to him. He inherited it. Therefore, the voice he had believed for all those years was not even his own. It was the voice of his father. He now considers that maybe he can like hiking, and if he can tell a different story about it, he might really begin to enjoy it and do it more often. So let me ask you, how much of what you think most of the time is just programming? Remember, it's not what happens to you that matters. It's what you think about what happens to you that will determine your course of action or inaction, effectiveness or ineffectiveness. What you think about what happens to you is your interpretation or story. This interpretation is in a large part determined by your past experiences, culture, upbringing, religious beliefs, education, as well as your current peer group. As a hypnotherapist, I help my clients to be aware of and identify stories that they hold as beliefs that are holding them back from what they want to have, be, or do. I help them to see that since these stories are inventions maintained by the voice, that they're free to anytime choose or invent a new story. It's all made up anyway, so hopefully they can make up a story that is empowering, encouraging, and inspiring. I help them instill these new beliefs using the power of suggestion through hypnosis. In closing, let me leave you with this. Ultimately, whether your thoughts about yourself are true or not is irrelevant. What matters is this. What does your thinking do for you? Does it move you forward or hold you back? Give you joy or despair? Help you to love or disconnect you from loving? Help you grow or keep you stuck? You have a choice in what to think and believe about anything. So choose wisely. So for this week, observe and listen to the voice in your head, but don't you believe a word of it. And here's another thing you might do. Start using language patterns, also known as affirmations, that make you feel good, even if you don't believe them. I think affirmations are really helpful in getting used to and cultivating a new, higher level of self-talk. The voice in your head is like a wild horse taking you wherever it wants to go. When the voice in your head finally stops talking, you experience inner peace. That's a quote by Miguel Angel Ruiz, author of The Four Agreements, a great book if you ever get a chance to read it. I hope you enjoyed today's podcast. I hope it gave you something to think about. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I look forward to talking with you again soon. Bye now.